In today's episode, we're diving into the most disturbing animal attacks ever caught during a selfie. From a tiger that broke loose at a private animal compound in Texas, to a grizzly in Alaska's wild Denali Park that turned a photo moment into a deadly encounter. Let's begin with the first story. On June 17, 2014, the morning sun rose over the São Paulo Wildlife Park in Brazil, casting golden streaks across dew-slick walkways and rustling palm fronds. The park was quiet, hours from the buzz of tourists. Inside, birds rustled in their enclosures, and somewhere near the back, a lion's low rumble echoed off stone. It was a day like any other, or so it appeared. Marco Oliveira, a 32-year-old senior zookeeper, arrived earlier than usual. He had done this many times before, always quiet, always punctual. His co-workers knew him as soft-spoken, often keeping to himself during breaks, sometimes skipping group lunches altogether. He wasn't antisocial, just content in silence. The zoo for Marco was more than a job, it was his world. He lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment less than a mile from the park entrance. He had no close family in São Paulo. His parents had retired to a rural town in the south, and his older brother had moved abroad years ago. Marco rarely talked about them, he rarely traveled, rarely took time off, and never strayed far from his routine. On weekends, even when he wasn't scheduled to work, he would walk the zoo's outer paths, jotting down notes on animal behavior or photographing enclosure designs he admired. Among the animals, Marco was known, trusted, especially in the carnivore section where he'd worked for years. He spoke to them like old friends, even the more temperamental ones seemed calmer around him. That connection wasn't just professional, for Marco it was deeply personal. A few months before the incident, Marco had been assigned an additional role by park management, overseeing the zoo's social media accounts. It wasn't part of his original job, but with his eye for photography and quiet dedication to the animals, he seemed like a natural fit. Management wanted more visibility, and Marco began posting updates, feeding sessions, close-ups of the animals, morning routines. At first, it was just part of his routine, but gradually the boundaries between care and content began to blur. Before he was asked to manage the zoo's social media, his own accounts were filled with soft-focus animal portraits, rarely selfies. His captions read more like diary entries, quiet observations about the way a jaguar breathed during a nap or how sunlight caught the shimmer of a lizard's scales. To those who worked with him, Marco was dependable to a fault. He never missed a shift, never raised his voice, he wasn't ambitious in the conventional sense, never chasing promotions. But he took pride in consistency. Quiet, steady, unseen by most, but absolutely present. Despite his quiet nature, Marco had embraced the new role the park had offered, managing its social media. He never asked for it, but when the position was offered, he took it seriously. It gave him purpose beyond just feeding schedules and cleaning enclosures. He began taking photos, first of the animals, then of himself with the animals. Always at a distance behind fences or glass, sometimes with a colleague nearby to frame the shot. These posts gradually boosted the zoo's online following. Management noticed, so did Marco. Over time, the post became more polished. He learned lighting tricks, angles, hashtags. At 8:43 a.m. that day, 15 minutes before opening, Marco was seen on the facility's high-definition security cameras entering the large predator wing, specifically near the African lion enclosure. He had his feeding gear with him, meat bucket, gloves, boots, but unusually he also held his personal phone. The cameras captured every step. There was no scheduled feeding at that hour, and the senior carnivore keeper who normally oversaw lion protocols was off duty. Marco moved with purpose. CCTV showed him unlocking the secondary gate with two codes, his own and a second code he had obtained days earlier by claiming he needed to cover a sick colleague's shift. With no one else present, he bypassed the two-person safety protocol. He paused at the gateway, glanced back once at the empty corridor, then entered the enclosure's prep chamber. Inside, he partially raised one of the overhead blinds to let in more light. The camera caught him checking the screen of his phone, adjusting it in his hand. he stepped through the final door into the lion enclosure. The enclosure mimicked the Tanzanian savanna, with scattered rocks, a small pond, and a shaded sleeping platform. At the far end, Caesar, the park's star attraction, rested under a tree. The 450-pound male lion was still, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Marco set down the feeding gear like usual, perhaps to make the scene look routine if anyone questioned it later. Then he took a few steps forward, phone in hand, turned his back to Caesar, and began raising the camera. His intent was clear: frame the perfect shot with the lion in the background. Maybe a short video, maybe just a still. Something striking to boost the zoo's morning engagement. At this point, no one else was nearby. The corridor camera showed no other staff in the area. Marco was alone. Caesar's head lifted, his eyes fixed on the shape intruding on his territory. At 8:46 a.m., the lion moved. It began with a low growl, barely audible on the CCTV audio feed. Caesar rose from his spot, muscles rippling beneath his golden coat, and took a single step forward. The motion caught Marco's attention. He turned slightly too late, the phone still raised. The lion didn't hesitate. He charged. 15 feet of distance vanished in under 2 seconds. Marco flinched, stumbling backward as the camera feed blurred. The impact knocked him flat on his back, his phone spinning away into the dirt. A second camera, mounted from a different angle, captured the precise moment Caesar leapt, claws extended, jaws wide. Marco screamed. The first swipe raked across his left shoulder and neck, tearing through fabric and skin. He rolled instinctively, trying to protect his face, but Caesar was on him before he could regain his footing. The lion's massive front paw landed on Marco's ribcage, pinning him down with crushing force. A second later, Caesar sank his teeth into Marco's side, just below the ribcage. Blood pooled instantly. In the corridor, a junior keeper, returning early from a coffee run, heard the distant sounds and turned toward the enclosure hallway. At first, it was just a noise, a thud, then a muffled cry. But the next sound, a frantic, guttural scream, made her drop her cup and run. Inside the enclosure, Marco was struggling, kicking weakly, trying to crawl backward as Caesar dragged him by the leg. The lion clamped down again, this time on Marco's lower back, shaking violently. His screams grew shorter, raspier. One final twist from the lion's neck, then silence. The junior keeper reached the control panel, slammed the emergency alarm, and triggered the lockdown. Within seconds, sirens echoed through the predator ring. 2 more staff members arrived, fumbling with the emergency tranquilizer kit, but it was no use. By the time they accessed the secondary gate, Marco's body was still, and Caesar was circling, agitated by the noise, blood staining its jaw. Staff used a loud sound deterrent to force Caesar into the holding pen before entering the enclosure. They pulled Marco out under armed watch, but it was already too late. His body bore deep lacerations across the chest, stomach, and back. His skull had been fractured, his ribs crushed under the weight of Caesar's strike. He was pronounced dead before emergency services even arrived. The Sao Paulo Wildlife Park remained closed for 3 days. Behind the scenes, staff were devastated. Marco had been one of them, quiet, reliable, deeply committed. Grief mixed with confusion as news spread that he had bypassed safety systems he once helped train new staff to follow. The footage left no room for speculation. He had acted alone, deliberately, and fatally outside protocol. In the days that followed, the zoo implemented emergency changes. Biometric scanners replaced code-based access for all predator enclosures, and marketing responsibilities were permanently separated from animal care roles. The lion, Caesar, was not euthanized. Authorities ruled that the animal had reacted as any apex predator would when confronted by a human inside its territory. Nestled in the eastern reaches of India lies Odisha, a land where ancient forests meet modern civilization. For centuries, these dense jungles have harbored secrets and dangers, their paths walked by both holy men seeking enlightenment and predators seeking prey. Here in the dense woodlands of the Nabarangpur district, humans and wildlife maintain an uneasy coexistence, one that would be shattered on a warm evening in May 2018. The Kumar family lived in a modest two-room house on the outskirts of Nabarangpur. Rajesh Kumar, 34, had spent the past decade as a taxi driver, logging endless hours behind the wheel of his aging Tata Indica, a compact car commonly used for transport in India. Its worn exterior and creaking suspension bore the marks of years spent navigating this region's rugged, unpaved roads. Each morning, he would wake before sunrise, kiss his sleeping daughters Anjali and Divya goodbye, and head out in search of fares. His wife Priya would pack him a simple lunch of roti and dal, carefully wrapped in newspaper. They couldn't afford proper containers, but Rajesh never complained. He never imagined that his last early morning with his family would come so soon. That May evening had been different from his usual fare runs. A wealthy businessman had hired several taxis, including Rajesh's, to transport guests from his son's wedding. The Maharaja Golden Marriage Hall had been transformed into a scene from a Bollywood movie, with crystal chandeliers, imported flowers, and food served on gold-plated thalas. As Rajesh ferried the final group of guests home, he couldn't help but think of his own simple wedding to Priya 7 years earlier. Just a small ceremony in the local temple, followed by a modest meal. His passengers, still dressed in their expensive silk garments, chatted about the lavish dowry and the bride's diamond jewelry. The setting sun cast long shadows through the sal trees, turning the narrow road into a corridor of flickering golden shadow. As Rajesh drove, he passed occasional signs warning of wildlife crossings, common in this region where human settlements bordered thick forests teeming with life. In recent weeks, villagers had reported an increase in bear sightings. Several farmers had lost livestock, and forestry officials had issued advisories about sloth bears venturing closer to human settlements. Though primarily insectivores, these bears were known to react aggressively when startled, and with the dry season reducing food availability, encounters had become more frequent. But warnings were easy to ignore, until the danger is staring right back at you. And for Rajesh Kumar, that moment was coming fast. Rajesh pulled his taxi over near a small clearing, needing to relieve himself after hours on the road. His passengers, still in their wedding finery, urged him to wait until they reached the next town, but he stepped toward the tree line, unaware of the danger that lay ahead. It was then, as he approached the forest edge, that he spotted it, a massive sloth bear lying near a small pond. What Rajesh didn't realize was that he'd encountered one of Odisha's most lethal predators. Unlike their Himalayan cousins, these sloth bears had adapted to live surprisingly close to human settlements, making them particularly dangerous. Growing up to 6 feet tall when standing and weighing over 300 pounds, they are primarily insectivores, feeding on termites, ants, and fruit. They rarely prey on large animals and typically avoid human interactions. However, when startled or provoked, they can be highly aggressive. Their powerful claws and incredibly strong jaws, capable of crushing coconuts with ease, make them fatal when defending themselves. His passengers shouted for him to hurry back to the taxi, but something possessed Rajesh at that moment. Driven by the desire to take a selfie with the bear, he pulled out his simple phone and stepped closer, ignoring the desperate warnings from his passengers. The attack was quick and brutal. The bear's 5-inch claws tore through Rajesh's chest and abdomen, while its powerful jaws crushed his shoulder and neck. The force of the bear's bite was strong enough to shatter his collarbone and several ribs. His spine was severed in multiple places as the bear shook him violently, and deep lacerations covered much of his body. The attack lasted less than 2 minutes, but by the time the bear finally released him, Rajesh was already dead. In a remarkable display of nature's complexity, a stray dog that had been sleeping nearby suddenly charged forward, biting at the bear's legs in a desperate attempt to drive it away. The bear, already agitated, turned its fury on the smaller animal, swiping at it with its massive claws. The passengers, still frozen in shock inside the taxi, could do nothing but watch as the brutal attack unfolded. Once the bear moved away from Rajesh to focus on the dog, one of the passengers seized the opportunity to act. They scrambled out of the vehicle and ran back toward the road, flagging down a passing motorcyclist. The rider sped to the nearest village where locals quickly relayed the news to forest officials stationed at the Nabarangpur Wildlife Division. Nearly an hour later, a response team arrived with tranquilizer rifles. The bear was still lingering near the clearing, pacing and occasionally swiping at the now injured stray dog that continued barking from a distance. The officials fired 3 tranquilizer darts into the animal, waiting until it finally collapsed before approaching. Once the bear was fully sedated, they loaded it onto a transport vehicle to relocate it to a remote section of the forest. Rajesh's body was then recovered. His phone, still clutched tightly in his hand, revealed a cracked screen displaying his final act, a blurred image of an approaching mass of fur and teeth. After the bear was subdued with tranquilizer darts, authorities transported it to a remote forested area, far from human settlements. With the immediate danger contained, officials recovered Rajesh's body and documented the scene before informing his family. In the days that followed, the impact of his death rippled through the community. The wealthy family whose wedding guests he had been driving covered his funeral expenses and established a small fund for his daughter's education. His wife Priya took up work as a seamstress despite her ongoing health concerns, now forced to provide for their children alone. The taxi company forgave the remainder of Rajesh's loan, allowing his family to keep their modest home. 1 year later, a small shrine stands quietly at the spot where Rajesh lost his life. A simple stone marker serves as both a tribute and a warning, a reminder of nature's unpredictable power and the irreversible price of a single misstep. To this day, people wonder why Rajesh, a hard-working and responsible father, chose to take that fatal selfie.